Margaret
I think you're
Hayes
ready for
sat
dessert.
alone at the corner
I think
table
you're
of
right.
Romano's Italian
Dessert.
restaurant,
You got it.
smoothing down the collar of her navy cardigan for the third time. At 58, she'd almost forgotten what first date nerves felt like. Almost. Her friend Susan had insisted on setting up this blind date, promising that Robert Chen was a genuinely good man who'd been widowed 3 years ago. Margaret had resisted at first, but loneliness has a way of wearing down even the strongest defenses. She glanced at her reflection in the restaurant window. Her graying hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and the soft lines around her eyes told stories of a life lived fully, if not always happily. She'd never married, never had children. For years, she'd told herself it was a choice. But lately, in the quiet evenings alone in her small apartment, she wondered if she'd simply been too afraid. "No one wants to date me," she'd confessed to Susan just yesterday, her voice barely above a whisper. The words had hung in the air between them, heavy with years of rejection and disappointment. Margaret had tried dating in her 30s and 40s, but each relationship had ended the same way. The men always wanted someone younger, someone without her responsibilities. You see, Margaret had spent 20 years caring for her aging parents, watching friends marry and start families, while she managed doctor's appointments and medications. By the time her mother passed 2 years ago, Margaret felt invisible, like she'd missed her chance at the life she'd dreamed of. The restaurant door opened, bringing with it a gust of cool October air. A man entered, his salt and pepper hair slightly disheveled, his warm brown eyes scanning the room with gentle uncertainty. He wore a checkered flannel shirt under a brown jacket, and there was something immediately kind about his weathered face. This had to be Robert. Margaret raised her hand tentatively, and his face broke into a relieved smile. As he approached, she noticed he walked with the careful gait of someone who'd worked with his hands all his life. "Margaret," his voice was soft, almost apologetic. "I'm Robert. I hope I haven't kept you waiting." "Not at all," she said, managing a smile despite the butterflies in her stomach. "Please, sit down." They settled into an easy conversation over breadsticks and water. Robert explained he was a carpenter by trade, still working part-time though he was 62. His wife, Jennifer, had died from cancer 3 years ago, leaving him to raise their 9-year-old triplet daughters alone. As he spoke about Emma, Lily, and Sophie, his entire face transformed with love and exhaustion in equal measure. "I'll be honest with you, Margaret," Robert said, his fingers fidgeting with his napkin. "Dating at my age with 3 young daughters, most women run for the hills. I understand it's a lot to take on, but Susan spoke so highly of you, and I thought maybe I should try." Margaret felt something shift in her chest. Here was a man apologizing for the very thing that made him who he was, a devoted father putting his heart on the line despite knowing the odds. She reached across the table, surprising herself, and gently touched his hand. "Tell me about them," she said softly. "Tell me about your girls." Robert's eyes lit up, and for the next hour he painted pictures with his words. Emma, the oldest by 4 minutes, was the serious one, always reading and asking questions that made him feel like he needed a philosophy degree. Lily was their artist, covering every surface with drawings and seeing beauty in things most people overlooked. And Sophie, the baby of the family, was their spark of mischief and laughter, always ready with a joke or a hug. "They miss their mother every single day," Robert said quietly, his voice catching. "And I try my best, but there are conversations I don't know how to have with them. They're growing up, and I'm terrified I'm failing them." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "You're not failing them. They have a father who loves them enough to be scared. That's not failure, Robert, that's devotion." The evening flew by. They discovered they both loved old black and white movies, that they'd both grown up in small Midwestern towns, and that they both took their coffee the same way, with just a splash of cream. When the check came, Robert insisted on paying, his old-fashioned courtesy somehow touching rather than condescending. As they stood outside the restaurant, the streetlights casting a warm glow on the autumn leaves scattered across the sidewalk, Robert turned to her. Would you like to do this again? I had a really wonderful time tonight, Margaret." She wanted to say yes. The word was right there on her tongue. But fear, that old companion, wrapped its fingers around her throat. "Robert, I don't know if I'm what you need," she heard herself saying. "I've never had children. I don't know the first thing about raising daughters. I wouldn't want to disappoint them. Or you." Robert's expression was understanding, not disappointed. "Margaret, I'm not looking for someone to replace their mother. I'm looking for someone who might want to share this life with us in whatever way feels right. No pressure, just possibility." They parted with a promise to talk soon. But as Margaret drove home that night, doubt crept in like fog. She'd barely slept 2 hours when her phone rang the next morning at 7:30. She fumbled for it, her reading glasses sliding down her nose as she checked the screen. Robert. "Margaret, I'm so sorry to call this early." His voice was rushed, strained. "I'm in a terrible bind. I have an emergency job. A roof collapsed at the senior center downtown, and they need it fixed today before the rain comes. But my usual sitter canceled, and the girls, I have no one to watch them. I know it's asking too much. I know we just met. But Susan's out of town, and I'm desperate. Could you possibly—" Margaret sat up in bed, her heart pounding. Every instinct told her to make an excuse. She didn't know these children. What if they didn't like her? What if she said the wrong thing, did the wrong thing? What if this was too much, too fast? But she thought of Robert's kind eyes, of the love in his voice when he spoke about his daughters, of the loneliness she'd felt for so many years. "What time should I be there?" she heard herself ask. An hour later, Margaret stood on the porch of a modest, 2-story house with blue shutters and a slightly overgrown garden. Her hands trembled as she knocked. Robert opened the door immediately, his face flooding with relief. "Thank you," he said, his hand briefly touching her shoulder. "Thank you so much. They're good kids, I promise. There's sandwich stuff in the fridge, and they know they need to do their homework. I'll be back by 5 at the latest." He called up the stairs. "Girls! Come meet Miss Margaret." What came down those stairs was a whirlwind. 3 identical faces, 9 years old, with their father's dark hair and their mother's delicate features. They stopped halfway down, 3 pairs of curious eyes studying. Margaret with the brutal honesty only children possess. "You're the lady from Dad's date," said the one with glasses. Who Margaret guessed was Emma. Her voice was neither welcoming nor hostile, merely observational. "I am," Margaret said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Your father had an emergency at work, so I'm going to spend the day with you if that's all right." "Do you know how to make French toast?" asked the girl with paint stains on her shirt, probably Lily. "I do, actually. It was my father's favorite." "Can you do a cartwheel?" The third girl, Sophie, was grinning, already sensing a potential playmate. "Not anymore," Margaret admitted with a small laugh. "My cartwheel days are behind me, I'm afraid." Robert kissed each daughter on the head, gave Margaret one more grateful look, and hurried out the door. The moment it closed, the house fell silent. Margaret stood in the entryway, 3 young girls staring at her, and she had absolutely no idea what to do next. "So," Emma said carefully, "our dad said you've never had kids." "That's true," Margaret replied honestly. "I took care of my parents instead when I was younger. And then, well, I suppose life just went a different direction than I expected." "Do you wish you'd had kids?" Lily asked, tilting her head. It was such a direct question, the kind adults learned not to ask. Margaret considered lying, softening the truth. But something about these 3 faces, so open and waiting, made her choose honesty instead. "Sometimes," she said softly. "Especially now. But we don't always get what we wish for. We get what we're given, and we learn to make the best of it." Sophie bounded down the last few steps. "Well, you've got us. Today, what should we do?" The morning started awkwardly. Margaret made French toast while the girls did their homework at the kitchen table. Emma worked through her math problems with fierce concentration. Lily kept doodling in the margins of her worksheets, little flowers and birds appearing between the sentences. Sophie asked questions every 30 seconds. About everything from why the sky was blue to whether Margaret thought dogs could understand human language. "Sophie, let Miss Margaret breathe," Emma said with the exasperation of an older sister, though she was only minutes older. "It's all right?" Margaret said, flipping the last piece of toast. I don't mind questions. My mother used to say that questions mean you're paying attention to the world. After breakfast, as Margaret washed dishes, Lily appeared at her elbow with a sketchbook. Would you like to see my drawings? She asked shyly. They sat together on the worn couch, and Lily showed her page after page of remarkable artwork. There were portraits of her family, landscapes of places she'd imagined, and on one page, a beautiful woman with long dark hair, smiling. That's our mom, Lily said quietly. I draw her so I won't forget what she looked like. Margaret's throat tightened. She was beautiful. You have her eyes, I think. Everyone says that, Lily replied. Emma has her brain and Sophie has her smile. Dad says we each got a piece of her, so she's still with us always. The afternoon brought its challenges. Sophie knocked over a glass of juice and Margaret cleaned it up without fuss. Emma retreated to her room to read, needing space, and Margaret understood that need for solitude. But it was around 3 o'clock when things shifted. Margaret had been looking at the family photos on the mantel, her heart aching at the pictures of Jennifer, vibrant and alive, holding her tiny babies, laughing at birthday parties, just being a mother. You look sad, Sophie observed, appearing beside her. I suppose I am a little, Margaret admitted. I was thinking about all the things I never got to do, all the moments I missed out on. Like what? Oh, like teaching someone to ride a bike or reading bedtime stories or just being needed. Really needed. Sophie considered this seriously. Then she took Margaret's hand, her small fingers wrapping around Margaret's worn ones. You're needed now, she said simply. We need someone to be here today, and you're here. That counts. It was such a small thing, just a child's observation. But something inside Margaret cracked open. This little girl who'd lost her mother too young was offering comfort to a grown woman she barely knew. It was a kindness so pure it took Margaret's breath away. You're right, Margaret whispered. Thank you for reminding me. By the time Robert returned at 4:45, the house was filled with laughter. Margaret sat at the dining table with all 3 girls playing a board game she hadn't touched in 30 years. They'd made cookies together, the kitchen still dusted with flour. Lily had drawn a picture of Margaret to add to her collection, and Emma had emerged from her room to explain her favorite book series in passionate detail. Robert stood in the doorway, just watching for a moment, his eyes suspiciously bright. Dad! Sophie ran to him. Miss Margaret taught us how to make snickerdoodles, and she knows all the words to The Sound of Music. And she actually listened to my entire plot summary of the Percy Jackson series. Emma added, something like approval in her voice. She's nice, Dad, Lily said quietly. She's really nice. Robert looked at Margaret over his daughters' heads, and the gratitude in his expression went deeper than words could express. After the girls scattered to wash up before dinner, he walked Margaret to her car. I can't thank you enough, he began, but Margaret shook her head. Robert, I need to tell you something, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Last night, when I said I didn't know if I was what you needed, I was scared. I've been scared for so long that I almost forgot what it feels like to be brave. But today, with your daughters, I felt something I haven't felt in years. I felt useful, important, maybe even a little bit needed. She paused, gathering courage. I spent so long believing I'd missed my chance at having a family that I forgot families can be built, not just born into. Your girls, they don't need someone to replace their mother. But maybe they could use another person who cares about them. And maybe I could use that too. Robert's eyes were definitely misty now. Are you saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying I'd like to see you again, and them, if they'd like to see me. I can't promise I'll be perfect at this. I'll probably make mistakes, but I'd like to try. Margaret Hayes, Robert said, his voice thick with emotion. I think that might be the best thing anyone said to me in 3 years. They stood there in the golden autumn evening, 2 people who'd thought their chances at happiness had passed them by, discovering that sometimes life's best gifts come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. Over the following weeks, Margaret became a regular presence in their lives. She came for Sunday dinners, helped with homework on Wednesday evenings, and went to Lily's art show at school. She taught Emma about the books she'd loved at her age, watched animated movies with Sophie while braiding her hair, and listened to Robert talk about his work, his fears, his hopes for his daughter's futures. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when the girls tested her. pushing boundaries to see if she'd stay or leave like so many others had. There was the evening Sophie had a meltdown about a school project, screaming that Margaret wasn't her mother and couldn't tell her what to do. Margaret had sat quietly through the storm, waiting, until Sophie cried herself out, then held her while they both acknowledged the truth. She wasn't their mother, and she never would be, but she could be something else. Something they all needed. 6 months after that first blind date on a warm spring evening, Margaret sat in Robert's backyard watching the girls play. Emma was reading under the old oak tree. Lily was drawing the sunset, and Sophie was trying to teach their old dog, Chester, a new trick with limited success. Robert sat beside her on the porch swing, his hand finding hers naturally now, a gesture that had become as comfortable as breathing. "You know what Susan told me yesterday?" Margaret said softly. "She said she's taking full credit for this, for us." Robert chuckled. "She should. I'd given up on finding someone who could handle my chaos, and you'd convinced yourself no one wanted you." "We were both wrong," Margaret said, watching the girls. "So wonderfully wrong. Do you ever regret it?" Robert asked quietly. "Not having children of your own when you were younger?" Margaret thought about this carefully, the way she thought about most things. "I used to," she admitted. "But I'm learning that life doesn't follow the timelines we imagine. I didn't get to teach someone to walk or say their first words, but I got to be there when Lily won her art competition. I got to help Emma through her first heartbreak when that boy in her class was mean to her. I got to watch Sophie learn to ride her bike without training wheels, even if I missed the earliest years." She turned to Robert, her eyes bright with unshed tears of joy rather than sorrow. "Maybe I didn't get the beginning of the story, but I got invited into the middle, and that's its own kind of miracle." "You know they think of you as family now," Robert said. "They asked me last week if you'd be around for Thanksgiving. What did you tell them?" "I said I hoped so." "That I hoped you'd be around for a lot of Thanksgivings." Margaret leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steadiness she'd spent a lifetime looking for without knowing it. "I'd like that," she whispered. Sophie's voice called out across the yard. "Miss Margaret, come see! Chester finally did it!" As Margaret stood ready to celebrate this small triumph, Emma looked up from her book and smiled, a rare, genuine smile that lit up her serious face. Lily waved her over to see her drawing of the sunset, eager to share her art. And in that moment, Margaret understood something profound. She'd spent years believing that no one wants to date me because she was too old, too set in her ways, too ordinary. But Robert's triplet daughters had proved her wonderfully, beautifully wrong. They'd shown her that love doesn't have an expiration date, that family isn't just about biology, and that the best chapters of our lives can begin when we least expect them. Sometimes being wanted isn't about being perfect or young or unencumbered. Sometimes it's about showing up, being honest, and having the courage to let yourself be needed. Margaret had finally learned that the heart has infinite capacity to expand, to embrace new love even when you think it's too late. As she walked across the grass toward 3 smiling girls and a barking dog, toward a life she never imagined would be hers, Margaret Hayes felt something she hadn't felt in decades. She felt chosen. She felt cherished. Most of all, she felt like she'd finally come home.